Welcome to our CEO Insights sessions. We do 2 of these per month on the People Strategy podcast, and I cannot wait for you to join us this week as we chat with a CEO about key insights of how they've implemented a people strategy in their business. Join me in welcoming our guest for this week. We have an amazing guest on our show this week with Dr. Tom Mahoney. Dr. Mahoney is the superintendent of the Oregon School District, and he took over after several superintendents had gone through the district and brings a wealth of information, knowledge, and humility to the superintendent role as he really grew through the ranks and came into education without having the best educational experience himself. So join me in this great conversation as a follow-up to last week's conversation with Brad and Tom from Phoenix Performance Partners. Tom, it is fantastic to have you on the show and to chat a little bit more about your journey in education and, making some incredibly sustaining changes within the organization and with your leadership team. I'm curious, what in your life and career led you to care so deeply about serving kids?
Well, my background is I was a highly unlikable child. I can say that with a smile today, but I can tell you there were very few teachers who were happy to have me in their classroom. So for whatever reason, it wasn't that I was necessarily misbehaved, but socially, whatever stimulus came into me, my natural reaction to that stimulus was off-putting to my peers, to the teachers. And it was really, I remember as a kid feeling like there was something wrong with me because I couldn't figure this out, and wanting to be included and wanting to be part of a peer group, and ultimately feeling like a failure. So what I did is develop some skills that would protect my ego from those negative impacts or those negative experiences. And so I slowly withdrew and I shut down, and I didn't do well academically. Was able to manage somewhat socially so I could stay in school. But the first school I went to in kindergarten, I got kicked out of kindergarten because I just my reactions weren't appropriate. And along the way, there were people that were put into my life that saw more in me than I could see in myself and held me to that expectation. And slowly I started to develop those skills and started to develop some self-confidence, and then started to develop some self-worth, and then started to realize, I am lovable, number one. I do deserve good things in my life, and I have the capability and capacity to be successful at whatever I choose to do. And it was through that intervention of those people, teachers and coaches and my parents and my family, that drove me to want to then do that for other kids, because I've always felt like my population, me, was underserved in terms of schools are interesting. We tell you to come in. We want you to learn. We want you to explore what you're interested in. We want you to really be interested in our learning and be passionate. But stop. We're done with math. Let's move on to reading. Okay, be passionate about it. Stop. Now we're done with reading. We're moving on to science. I know you have questions, but I have to get through this. So those questions are for a later time. And so we have this idea of what we want school to be like, but then we really have this box in which we have all students that we want them to fit into. It's certainly been better more recently, but I felt like that the kids, people who don't understand kids, and this is going to be a little bit long because this is one of the things that I'm passionate about. Most teachers loved school, so they were in an environment where they learned how to do school well. Then they left school and they went to school at university to study school. They were good at school at the high school and junior and elementary level. They were good at school at the university level. Then they left school at the university level and came back to school. So their memory of school is a fun, loving place where they love to be there and they wanted to be there, and they just, they enjoyed learning, or they learned how to do well in the system. Well, in walks me, who has none of the same interests. So they're ill-equipped to be successful with me as a student. And so I'm very passionate about making sure that we're serving all of our students. And I just felt like it was really important to me to give back freely of that was given to me and changed my life. So, yeah.
Thank you for that story and sharing that impact for you. And you said a couple things that I want to point out. And it was, you had people in your life that saw you bigger than you saw yourself. You built your self-confidence, your self-worth, and had the capability and capacity to be successful. And looking at that teacher or educator that saw those things, I'm curious, tying back to what you just stated, did they also have a great learning environment and loved school? Or were they one where it was like, we need to figure out a different way because there's something here that we can truly do differently?
I'm not sure it's either. I think in every case, they were people who had high expectations for students and did not allow students to create excuses. So I want to be clear, many of our students have true reasons, true excuses of why things are hard for them, true hardships. But I learned that I could also create excuses to kind of blend in there so I didn't have to. And so in all cases, though, those were people in my life, at least, that had very high expectations, held me to those expectations, were able to sort through what wasn't a real reason or a manufactured reason. And I would say my belief is probably in most cases that they had challenging backgrounds themselves, so they had an insight into students like myself, and that they were able to provide that kind of pathway for me.
And I love something what you just said, and that was people who had high expectations for students and did not allow students to create the excuses. So often we're creating excuses for why something can't get done. And as we shift from students to supporting a team of educators, there's excuses all over the place as to why schools are failing.
So I don't think that dealing with adults is much different than dealing with children in terms of the concepts or the premise. I think the tools are different. I think the level of autonomy is different. I think the rate in which you move often has to be different because adults are far less pliable than students are and far less trusting. So you have to build deep relationships with adults to move those things, move whatever you're going on. All of that said, we all develop strategies in our lives to help us be successful. And that success sometimes is avoiding pain. So we have traumas in our life, big traumas that are really dramatic and small traumas. And we develop systems in which we allow ourselves to not have to feel the outcome of that. Those things work. So when I'm an 8-year-old and I'm feeling unloved, I create this persona of myself and this path for myself to stop that feeling. And it worked for me for a period of time. But at some point, that default success strategy stops working. And if I still stay with it, it starts becoming my adult excuse. And my favorite statement from an adult is when they say to me, "You don't understand." What they're telling me is really, not all the time, but most of the time, I have built this system and you're asking me to change that system, and that's really challenging. So those excuses are often couched in these systems we've built that are no longer, we don't need them. I'm not an 8-year-old anymore. I know I'm not unloved anymore. So anything I do that is protecting that part of myself, I don't need. And yet still there's times in my life where I do that.
I love that nugget of you don't understand and what that specifically, means as far as the system. So I want to get into a little bit about the story of the Oregon School District. And, we heard from Tom and Brad last week on the show about how they truly partner with clients looking at key outcomes. So do you want to tell a little bit of your story?
Yeah, so I'd like to touch on partnering. I just, in my field, and I think all fields, I think there are vendor relationships where they are transactional, and that's okay. So we have somebody who's going to come and service our vending machines. They're going to come in, empty them out, put new stuff in. They're going to get a cut of the money. We're going to get a cut of the money. That is a transactional relationship. You're going to do something. I'm going to do something. We're going to have an exchange. We're done. But partners are different. And so I have an awful lot of people in the education space who come in and they say they want to partner with me. Well, I define partnership in when you're as vested in my outcomes as I am, then we're truly a partnership because we're both pulling for the same thing. And I've had very few relationships with any educational consultant or vendor or entity that's providing services that have reached the level that I have with the Phoenix Performance team. They truly have partnered in our success. And one of the things that gave me great pause was, if we do this and we invest this money, A, is it sustainable? And B, what is your responsibility to Brad and Tom? And the sustainability piece was taken care of by contacting other people who have done the work in other school systems. But the other part was their part of it. Their pledge to me was, and in their contract it was, we will not be done until you feel like you have reached the outcome you need to reach. That's an open-ended checkbook then for me. I can keep asking you until I feel like we're done. And they stayed with their pledge and they honored their pledge. And I think it was 4 or 5 months of work that they stayed with us and continued to support us until we felt like we were on firm footing. And I still reach out and contact them even now about things that have come up that might need, and they are still supporting us. So that has truly been a partnership with them. And so I was in a place where I came into the district and there had been 6 superintendents in a decade, and there were 23 total administrators in that same decade. So we are not a large district. There were three buildings. So when you have when you have 17 building administrative changes in a decade, there's something going on that's causing that type of turnover. And so when I got into the district, there were lots of things that needed support and help. The people were great, they were caring, but they had all but shut down in terms of listening to leadership because they had been through so many leaders. They were sick of the next new thing and the next direction we were going. So it took a long time to kind of rebuild systems and move toward just effective governance. I'm not even talking about effective outcomes. I'm just talking about effective practices and procedures. And so we did that. And then this is my 14th, I've been in the district 17 years, at 14 as superintendent. My 10th year as superintendent, I was really frustrated. We had fixed all the easy things and our outcomes were doing better. So we were able to improve efficiencies in transportation. We were able to improve the quality of food service. We were able to improve our purchasing and acquisition along any number of things. We were able to improve our services and technology to our staff, and our services and custodial service to our staff. Our customer service to our community, all it improved. Student outcomes weren't improving. And there's kind of an important purpose here for schools, and student outcomes is one of those areas. And I felt like we had all these systems in place that were aligned, and the research supported it to improve student outcomes. It didn't happen. And so I was stuck. At one point I said to my board president, I think this is a me problem. I think they're not hearing me anymore. I think I may have to go because we're not growing anymore, and I don't know what to do. I was stuck. And so when I get emails that come in that seem interesting, I will reach out. And Brad and Tom had sent something out, and I reached out to them, and we just started a conversation. And in that conversation, the outgrowth of that ended up being the work.
So share a little bit about the work that was done and what that specifically looked like for both you and your team.
So what I told Brad and Tom was, I felt like we were 90% there, but we were missing the most important 10%. So systems were in place, research-based, we had practices and procedures, but outcomes weren't occurring because there was something in there that was missing. They said, okay, well, here is our process. We're going to bring you in. We're going to provide you some feedback. You're going to work together as a team, and it's all going to be about the why. We're going to make sure that we can connect everyone's why together, because as we connect your why with the district's why, what's going to happen is you're going to align your work, your energies, and those things that seem difficult today will not seem as difficult after we're done with the work, because now your why is so powerful, you're willing to be uncomfortable to move toward that why. And so the process was a retreat with them. We did some pre-work, several meetings. We got some survey data back from the people, the 6 closest people to us in the organization. And it was very honest, sometimes difficult feedback to hear. And we shared this in an open setting. And it created a real bond in the team, number one, and then number two, a real vulnerability amongst the teammates. And so there was this shared level of experience that going through this had created a cohort that was very tight and close. And ultimately what we landed on as a team, and I want to be clear, it's not that Brad and Tom drove us there, it's this, we landed on this as team, is we lacked high level of accountability to each other. Essentially, our team wouldn't hold each other accountable for what they said they were going to do and what they didn't do. And it was always me being the one holding them accountable. And if it's always me being the one holding them accountable and they can all tell each other things and still support each other when they know it's not the truth, we were getting stuck. We weren't improving. So the biggest outgrowth of that was just our team holding each other accountable at a level we had never done before. We decided to do that. We did that. We put practices in place to make sure that's occurring. It's still not where we need to be, but it has improved dramatically. And by holding each other accountable at the building level on a regular basis, they then, again, connected back with their whys, and things that had been difficult before were not as difficult now because their why was bigger.
I'm curious. You talked about a retreat and really having these conversations within that setting, which you said the biggest outgrowth was them holding each other accountable. There's a trained learning in how to have these conversations. And typically there's a huge fear of, how do I have a conversation that's an accountability conversation? And it's almost one of those things that we have to embody before we can actually start doing it in day-to-day without a structured support. What did that look like for folks to get comfortable being uncomfortable to grow?
So I said we had done 90% of the work. We had a high level of trust, and there had been a high level of vulnerability. So most of what was shared, not everything, because it became, people got very raw and really shared at a deep, deep level. Most of what was shared, we were all aware of. So that helped start with us at a higher level. The key to the work for me was that a lot of this is done in and around the word coaching. And so coaching isn't coaching unless somebody asks for it or is willing to take it. So if you call me, Traci, and say, hey, Tom, I've got a problem, I'd like some coaching on this, you're not asking me for advice or mentoring, you're asking me to coach you. And those are three different things. If we're in a group setting and you're my peer, I can say to you, are you willing to take some coaching on that? Which is our code word for, I'm going to ask you some questions or say some things that may be hard to hear, but are really meant to be supportive. And so for us, that has been the mechanism in which we lever that coaching. And there are times when it becomes attacking, when somebody says something and somebody just immediately responds and says, you didn't say that last week. This is what you said last week. Well, now you've got two people who are defensive, and we don't get to accountability that way. We get to defensiveness and rationalization. So that's why there's still a work in progress. But we frame all of that work around coaching, and always, I'm vested in your outcome. We have connected whys. I want your why to be as big as mine is successful. How do I help you do that?
And with that coaching, one of the things that you stated with coaching is we have to have that trust with each other first. And coaching is one of those items that's incredibly, incredibly personal. And, as we kind of chatted previously about your experience, it's like, unless we take our whole selves into the conversation, because it's the whole pot of soup, and bring that trust with each other, we also will almost have a superficial conversation. So how do you kind of work with that with your team, now that you've passed kind of that initial stage?
Well, I think that there's two things. For the coachee, it's incumbent upon the coachee to have some level of vulnerability. I doubt that, Traci, that people are truly bringing them whole selves into many of those situations, because there are things that maybe only my wife knows, or only my little brother or big brother know, right? I mean, there's just things that, for whatever reason, I'm still holding on to, that I won't be that vulnerable. But if I can get somebody to open up the vulnerability wall at any level, because we're not vulnerable because we're afraid. There's really only two, my experience, this is not based on any research, there's two emotions. There's fear and there's love. And every other emotion is an iteration somewhere in that containment. When we don't do something And if we don't do it out of love, then we're not doing it because we're deeply caring about somebody else and we don't want to hurt them. When we're not doing it out of fear, we're worried about ourselves. We are afraid something is going to happen. Something bad is going to happen. Even if I'm worried about it for you, like, Traci, don't do that. I'm mostly worried about me because I don't have to go through what's going to happen, right? So
Right.
I just need them to move back from fear a little bit, maybe just to apprehension. And then we start to build that relationship when they start to see you're fully vested in their outcome, not my outcome. Then you get into that honesty and that growth. But even then, there's people I've coached for years that are now becoming more and more vulnerable as we go along the cycle because that trust level grows to a higher level. But I don't need them to be fully vulnerable, just a little bit. And then we can have those conversations and I can ask questions that cause you to reflect.
Thank you for kind of defining that a little bit further and what that looks like, because it definitely is a continuum as you go.
Yeah.
So you talked about fear versus love and moving towards those outcomes and being completely committed to their outcomes. How did this tie back to essentially the outcomes that you were looking for within the districts where you're like, this is a me problem, we're not moving the educational outcomes? What was the result of that?
So the net result was a dramatic increase in our ELA and math scores. So in our state, ELA and math are the two subjects that are tested, science somewhat lightly. And in our 3 through 8th grade, those are the elementary grades that get tested, we had dramatic increases. There was one teacher that in 1 year had a 308% increase in the number of students who met or exceeded on the state outcomes. Overall, we've had tremendous increases over a two-year period, almost a 200% increase in outcomes in terms of students who are succeeding. Remember, I said we had a system in place before that was good. I thought the system was good, but we were lacking something, that 10%. And I believe this was the 10%. And I want to be clear. I must have carried myself differently. Our administrators must have carried ourselves differently. Even though I felt like I was giving the same message, I must have delivered it differently because our staff does the work, our students do the work, our families do the work. But something we had said or done caused those increases to occur in those outcomes. And I'm not taking credit for it. I'm saying this was part of the process in that occurring.
Yeah, absolutely. So that, I'm almost hearing it's a way of being shift based on the coaching because the students felt that love versus the fear of we have to do this.
Yeah.
You stated at the beginning of our conversation, so much in schools, it's all right, it's math time. All right, stop. We got to go to reading time. We got to go to this, to that. How did the structure that our education system is set up and what your staff were learning and implementing, how did those two things conflict and work together?
Well, I think they more conflicted than worked together. I'm just going to be honest with you. And so, yeah, we're it's trying to build the airplane as you're flying it, that saying. And we certainly we've become more flexible with both students learning as well as student behavior in terms of trying to, there was one answer when a student misbehaved in the past: detention, suspension, expulsion. That was the answer at all times. Be punitive and then try to move them on. We have certainly moved more toward restorative practices where we're trying to better understand the students, equip them with the skills they need to manage their own behavior better. That's more flexibility then. And I think there'll probably be some type of a blended method that goes on. And then in terms of structure, it's trying to give students more choice while they're in the areas that they're focused on. So certainly educational software allows for a lot more choice in terms of how you used to have one book, right? Like the teacher had a copy of this one book. We all got the same book. You could now teach the same standard through any number of books and kids can select their own kind of pathway as they go through that. So there's more of that going on. But again, I don't think that had anything to do with the outcome increases. I truly believe it was the way we communicated, the way we consistently or persistently, depending on, I guess, the receiver, right? If it feels like you're getting beaten over the head, it's a persistent message. If it feels like you're hand in hand, it's a consistent message. How we handled everyday things led us to these outcomes. The only thing that went different was that retreat. That's the only thing we did different. And so I am a firm believer that unlocked in us all these other things that allowed us to do those things. So they were all latent. They were all here. It just released them.
We have the answers within ourselves. Is how do we get there?
Right. And that's what coaching, the goal of coaching is. That's why the experience for me was ultimately a group coaching session, because coaching, my belief is when I'm coaching somebody, all I'm doing, I'm not coaching the problem, I'm coaching the person. In you lies the answer. And I have a deep belief that 90% of my problems are created by me because of things I didn't do that I should have done, or things I did that I shouldn't have done. If I can better understand myself, I lower the number of problems I have because I start to better understand why I'm behaving the way I'm behaving and what those outcomes will result in.
Beautiful definition of self-awareness, right? And so, based on our conversation today, what's a last thought that you'd like to leave our listeners with?
Well, I think one of my favorite sayings is, I take me with me wherever I go. And the reason that's, so important to me is that, my experience in educational leadership and my own personal kind of leadership journey, and this experience with Tom and Brad only reinforces this. The things that I'm still holding on to that I haven't been able to, the trauma, I'll call them the traumas, the big traumas, the little traumas, right? The big traumas, the real big things that have happened. Then the little things, like I got hurt because, the way my wife looked at my socks this morning. I shouldn't, but I did, right? That's a little trauma for me. I'm holding on to something that's limiting my growth and capacity and limiting my impact on others, which is really what I would say my mission is. My mission is to lead, serve, and grow at all times, in all ways. And so if that's really what it's imperative I do, the sooner I can understand that and unlock those things and move past those things and put in new default success strategies, the sooner I'm going to have a larger impact with my mission. And so I just encourage everyone to do the work, do the growth. If you are in an organization and you need organizational growth, I would highly suggest you reach out to the Phoenix Performance Team. It was the best, the most transformative, and the best ROI on any investment we've ever made in our team.
Humility, impactful, and passionate is so much of what I took away from this conversation with Dr. Mahoney, and really going through how did Oregon School District make the transformational changes within their leadership team. And my 3 takeaways from this week are: 1, you don't understand. 2, partnerships. 3 is self-reflection. So let's dig a little bit deeper into those 3 key takeaways. The people strategies that we can put in place to support our organization to really get the business outcomes. So that first one is you don't understand. And Dr. Mahoney was really talking about how we will create excuses for ourselves. And, it may have been that at some point in time, this was the only way we knew how to do it. But as we continue to grow as people and evolve, we find new ways to doing it. But when we state you don't understand, we are making an excuse. And excuses allowed in organizations do not allow an organization to grow. So that insight of you don't understand was so powerful because it was that trigger to say, hey, there's something more here if I got truly curious with this individual to figure out what is underneath it so that we can remove the excuse and actually move the item forward. And so as we look at that as a people strategy is what are those items that we can listen into to see what are excuses that are actually stopping folks from being bigger than they think themselves possible to be and from getting the results that we're looking for, in this case, the students that they are serving in the district. So the second insight that I had here was partnerships. And Dr. Mahoney talks about transactional vendor relationships versus a true partnership. And in this case, we're talking about partnerships with external consultants. But I really want you to think about what is the partnership that you have with every member of your team. Is that partnership with the individual members of your team where you are invested in that outcome as much as they are? And so if you think about, your employees and those team members that are working with you, How invested are you in their outcomes, and how vested are they in those outcomes? When we have a true partnership, we're willing to get underneath to say, what is it that we need to do to truly move folks forward and to truly work with them and coach with them for them to see there is the potential here that is bigger than I see myself, and I'm as vested in that as they are, and we have the agreement on those core goals. And that is a key strategy that comes in from that mindset and that commitment to that. And then the third that we talked about is the self-reflection. Guess what? Our hand is always in every item that we have or every issue and every outcome. So, Dr. Mahoney talked about self-reflection and essentially stating the fact that we're not moving our scores forward is a me problem. That's on me, not on anyone else. So he had that, ownership of the results. And when he completely owned that ownership of the results and the fact that we're not getting the results that we're specifically looking for, he then could see what is that 10% and being willing to be open to that growth. And growth is incredibly uncomfortable. So that people strategy is, where are we willing to truly have the self-reflection and the humility to say, I'm going to 100% own this. And when we have the ownership at every level within the organization, that starts to raise the bar as to what those key expectations are in order to reach those key results. So those were my 3 key takeaways from this conversation with Dr. Mahoney. Thank you so much for listening in. Have a great week. Thank you so much for listening today. I'd love to connect with you. If you'd like to connect, you can find me on LinkedIn at Traci, Traci Austin, and at our website at elevatedtalentconsulting.com. If you'd love to learn more about our process, please reach out to us. And again, thank you so much for listening and sharing your feedback with us through a review. Have a fantastic day.